Lighting, composition and timing are all important for capturing the perfect photo. But there's one crucial element that can make or break our shots, and that's exposure. In this video, we'll be taking a look at some in-camera tools that will help us to get the perfect shot, and also a few considerations that I run through when deciding on how to expose for a certain scene. So it's another beautiful day, and we're heading to an amazing location. It's a location I've visited before, and I've been wanting to come back to for some time. Let's get on up the trail and see if we can make an image this evening, whilst we talk about some key ingredients to getting the perfect exposure. So firstly, and probably no surprise that I'm mentioning this first, but I would recommend shooting in RAW, as this will help to give us more flexibility with our exposure when editing our images in post-production. The next tool to help with controlling exposure is Blinkies, or Live View Highlight Alert. And this tool can help us to see if we've got clipped highlights within the scene. It can be quite annoying though to have it switched on all of the time, because it will always be flashing at us if we've got something overexposed within our scene. So I only activate this when I really need it, if I've got maybe changing lighting conditions or a very, very difficult scene to expose for. But it is really useful though. Some cameras have zebras which you can set to come on a specific highlight value, which can be really, really useful actually. It's similar to the blinkers that we've just mentioned, however you've got greater control as to what exposure value they're activated. My camera has this, but only for video mode, unfortunately. It can be especially useful though for seeing when skin tones are becoming overexposed. So that's when I tend to use it. So one of the great things about mirrorless cameras is that we can see exactly what we're shooting on the rear LCD and EVF. But there are several considerations that are worth mentioning, because they can greatly change the outcome of the final photo. Now most cameras will have a few screen setup options. I make sure my screen brightness is set to a manual setting. It's always the same. So I've got mine set to 0 brightness, which is like the standard. And this means I'm used to exposing the scene based on this setup. If your camera screen is set to auto, it will fluctuate the brightness depending on the current ambient light setup. Obviously, this helps to see the rear LCD screen better in some situations, but because there's no common ground, I find it's more difficult to get used to. I've also got my picture profile set to a very neutral profile. Mine's set to standard, and I've reduced the contrast and saturation a touch. Now what I'm seeing on the LCD is almost identical to how my eyes are viewing the scene in front of me. I find this most helpful when composing a photo. There's also another reason for this, which I'll touch on in just a minute. This place is stunning, absolutely stunning. The next tool is the histogram. Now, most mirrorless cameras now give you the ability to view a live histogram. My camera has two types, the luminosity histogram and the RGB histogram. Both are really important for judging exposure. I'll be talking more about the RGB histogram and why it's so important later in the video, but for now I just want to focus more on the traditional luminosity histogram, because it's one of the most useful tools for gauging the correct exposure. The camera histogram is a graphical representation that displays the distribution of brightness levels in an image. It helps photographers assess exposure by showing whether the image is properly exposed. The pixels are shown on the histogram by plotting their quantity or frequency along the horizontal axis, representing the brightness levels from dark to light. Pure black on the left and pure white on the right, and the midtones in the middle. The vertical axis represents the number of pixels at each brightness level, forming a graphical representation of the distribution of tones within the image. Whenever we see pixels touching either end of the graph, we'll see that we either have pure white or pure black in the image. Those pixels will have no detail, they will be completely clipped. This is a great tool for us to see if we're losing highlights or shadows within the image. It also tells us what the range of tones looks like. For example, if we're taking a shot of middle grey, those tones, if correctly exposed, will be in the middle of the graph. If we underexpose the image, we can make those tones completely black. And this is why it's so helpful, because it can give us the information to help with how we want to expose a scene from a creative perspective. One thing to watch out for though is your histogram will be a representation of your LCD. So if you're using a picture profile, then your histogram will reflect that picture profile. Picture profiles typically hold a lot more contrast than the RAW file does, meaning the RAW file will be different to what we see on the LCD. To overcome this, I like to switch between natural live view when I'm dialing in my final exposure, as this gives me a similar representation to the RAW file. See how the histogram changes as I toggle here between the assigned picture profile and my natural live view. So here we've got our picture profile, and as you can see, the blinkers are telling us that we're overexposed in the top right hand corner of the frame. Now if I switch to natural live view, you can actually see that nothing is overexposed. And this is going to be more representative of the RAW file. So actually, we don't need to reduce our exposure. We actually have all of the information there. If I switch back to the more contrasty picture profile, we can see that we're clipping. So we have to take into consideration what we're seeing on our LCD, as this will be represented in the histogram. So the picture profile helps with composition and natural live view helps with the exposure. In a moment, I'll be sharing several considerations to achieve the perfect exposure, but first I need to get an image here this evening to start off the photography. So I've no idea what I'm going to shoot, but I think there's going to be a fair few opportunities down at the beach, so I'm going to head down there first, see what I can find. So I'm flying the drone around the headland just there, capturing some B-roll, and as I was panning across the scene, I thought, hey, that might make quite a good photograph. Now, I'm fairly new to drone photography, I don't do a huge amount of it, but it is something I'd like to do more of. So that's exactly what I'm doing. So I'm doing a 5-shot bracket looking back towards the beach, 1-stop increments. It's quite difficult to see my phone here with the sun being so bright, but because I've not got the sun in the shot, I think it works quite well, and I'm not putting any of the blue sky in the shot either. I'm just framing it so we've got the tops of the cliffs behind me, this wonderful stretch of sand, and the crystal clear turquoise blue waters. Absolutely stunning water quality around here today. Beautiful. Yeah, these rock formations look great too. So I think it makes a good photograph. Fingers crossed. I'll put it up on the screen. Let me know what you think. So all of those tools I previously mentioned are great, but what is the perfect exposure? So typically when we think of the perfect exposure, we think of an image that neither the highlights or the shadows are touching the edge of the histogram, i.e. neither are clipping. But I think this is not necessarily the best approach. Now I've heard the term the perfect looking histogram, but I don't think there really is one, as we make decisions on how we would like that histogram to look by the composition and the exposure itself. So to get the perfect exposure, we need to first determine how we would like the final outcome of the image to look. You know, we need to pre-visualize that outcome. If we have a clear understanding of the outcome, we can then create the exposure required to make the histogram represent that outcome. I think that the histogram is a guide to tell us when the tones of the image are becoming under or overexposed, but it's up to us as photographers to decide where we want those tones to fall, meaning the perfect histogram is how we choose it to look. So you might have heard the term exposed to the right. And this is when you intentionally push the exposure towards the brighter end of the histogram. What you do is you maximise the amount of data captured in the shadows and the midtones. Now this approach helps to preserve important details and minimise noise in those areas. Additionally, it provides more flexibility during post-processing, allowing for better control over shadow and midtone adjustments. Exposing to the right can result in a cleaner, more vibrant image. Now, while exposing to the right of the histogram can be an effective technique in certain situations, it's not always the best approach for achieving perfectly exposed photos. Exposing to the right can lead to potential loss of information in the highlights and the midtones, and these areas may be overexposed in the process. This can result in lack of detail in those parts of the image. Now, every photograph and lighting situation is unique, and it's important to carefully evaluate the scene and consider the desired outcome before deciding on the optimal exposure settings. Striving for a balanced exposure that retains detail in both highlights and shadows can often yield more natural and visually pleasing results than pushing the histogram further than is necessary. I feel shadow is as important to a photograph as the midtones and the highlights. You know, without shadow, the image will lack contrast, and it's something I've seen a lot of in the past, especially with HDR photos. When an image has really lifted shadows, it can lack depth and contrast. And I like to get my raw file as close to the final result as possible. Now, if you do decide to expose to the right, a good tip here is to take a look at your RGB histogram to make sure a particular colour channel is not peaking too much, as this can lead to muted colours if a particular colour is too much overexposed. Take this scene here. If I expose to the right of the luminosity histogram, it looks fine. However, if we bring up the RGB histogram, we can see that this colour is slightly clipping or close to clipping, meaning it's possible that these colours will lack detail or maybe become muted. I often look at the RGB histogram when I'm shooting backlit trees or foliage, as this can really help. Been running around up here for quite a while trying to piece a shot together, and I think I've managed to find one that works quite well. I've got this patch of pink sea thrift down here in the foreground, nice bit of light on the cliffs there, and these amazing red boulders which are situated through the mid-ground. Nice bit of glow on the horizon as well, no cloud detail, but I think it works. I think it all ties together quite well. So I'm going to grab this shot now, 22nd f9, focusing about a third of the way into the scene. 2-second timer. Grab this one now. Yeah, I think it's a good one. Pretty pleased with how it looks anyway. I was thinking I weren't going to get a shot this evening. I'll put this image up now for you to take a look at, and then I might swing round and see if I can get a telephoto shot looking back down there at those pointy, craggy rocks. Whilst getting a good exposure is a key ingredient to getting a good photograph, there are many other things that can help us too. Now, I discussed some of those things in the video that's linked up the top there. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up, and why not consider sharing it if you think others might like it too. Anyway guys, until next week, take care and I'll see you soon.